So Finnair is the largest airline in hell. No, not that hell. Real hell. There you go. The largest airline and flag carrier of Finland. They're also the official airline of Santa Claus, which I thought was very interesting, with their main hub at Helsinki International Airport in the northeastern corner of the European Union. They're a very interesting airline, and on this video I want to talk about Finnair's route network and their advantages and disadvantages, as well as their fleet and how the coronavirus pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine have greatly affected them. You see, Finland has a very strategic location that has allowed Finnair to be one of the main airlines connecting Europe with much of Asia via Helsinki. You see, if you draw a straight line from many cities in Europe towards Japan, China, and other parts of Asia, you'll notice that many of these flights pass through northeastern Europe and Russia. So Helsinki is not really that far out of the way from these flight paths despite being so far north. And because Helsinki is much closer to Asia than most other European cities, Finnair can easily connect passengers from many European cities towards Asia via Helsinki. And because of this, unlike most other European airlines that focus most of their operations towards North America, Finnair, from quite early on, decided to focus much of their growth towards Asia, such that by 2019, Finnair had more destinations in Asia and Japan than any other European airline. Finnair oftentimes has been the first airline to fly to many airports in Asia. They were the first European airline to fly to Tokyo non-stop around the USSR in 1983, while every other airline had to stop in Anchorage because of Soviet airspace restrictions. They were the first to fly to Moscow in 1956, the first to fly to China in 1988, and many other destinations in East Asia. This advantage was expanded in 1994 when Finnair began flying to Japan non-stop over Russian airspace, which made the 13-hour flight into a 9 to 10-hour flight. Since then, Finnair has expanded their Asian network massively. By 2019, Finnair had 19 destinations in East Asia, but only 5 in North America. New York was Finnair's only destination in North America until 2014 when Miami was added on a seasonal basis, although Finnair did previously fly to Boston with the Boeing 757, but that was terminated. Finnair later launched flights to Chicago, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. Meanwhile, in Asia, Finnair was flying to 7 airports in China and 5 cities in Japan, as well as flights to South Korea, Thailand, Singapore, Hong Kong, India, and others as well. But you see, the connecting possibilities at Helsinki benefited flights to Asia much more than flights to North America. Most of the airline's revenue and passengers came from the Asia flights, so it only made sense to expand east rather than west, although it was possible to fly passengers from Russia, the Middle East, India, and Eastern Europe towards North America. Another thing that benefited Finnair was the joint venture with Japan Airlines, along with British Airways and Iberia, which allowed them to gain a much bigger share of the traffic between Japan and Europe, while also benefiting British Airways, Japan Airlines, and Iberia. Finnair also took part in the transatlantic joint venture with American Airlines, which is likely the reason why Finnair launched multiple flights to North America in the 2010s. Finnair also has a joint venture with Juneyao Airlines, which operates flights from Shanghai to Helsinki. The airline's fleet is key in helping the airline expand their international network. Finnair currently has 17 Airbus A350-900s. This is the backbone of Finnair's Asian network, and they would fly mostly to major cities in Asia. But even some secondary cities like Nagoya and Fukuoka would get this aircraft. The A350s also operated short-haul flights to major European cities like London and Amsterdam, and flights to Los Angeles and San Francisco. Finnair also has 8 Airbus A330-300s that they use to fly to North America and to many secondary cities in Asia. Finnair also has 5 Airbus A319s, 10 Airbus A320s, 15 Airbus A321s, and 12 Embraer E190s that are all used for the airline's short-haul operations within Europe and the Middle East, and finally 12 of the ATR-72s that are used in short regional flights. But anyway, things were going really well for Finnair in 2019. They launched flights to Beijing's Daxing Airport, Los Angeles, and Sapporo. In 2020, they were going to begin flights to Busan, South Korea, and Tokyo's Haneda Airport. This way, Finnair would fly to 2 airports in Beijing and in Tokyo. Things were going really well for the airline before everything went to hell in 2020 because of the coronavirus pandemic. Finnair was forced to cancel their flights to China early on in 2020. They later canceled flights to Japan, North America, and the rest of Asia. They also canceled many flights within Europe and grounded most of their fleet. Finnair had never dealt with a crisis like this. Their most important markets were closed, and even as they began to open up, recovery was very hard for Finnair because, as I mentioned before, Finnair relied heavily on flights to Asia. Most of East Asia had very strict restrictions on foreign travelers. China had some of the worst lockdowns in the world, and even now it's still pretty restrictive. In order to cope with the crisis, Finnair from early on began operating cargo-only flights to East Asia using the Airbus A350s, and as countries began opening up, they resumed flights to their most key destinations. Finnair also launched long-haul flights from Stockholm to the US and Thailand in order to better utilize their aircraft. This helped fill the gap left by Norwegian, which had previously operated such flights. And during this time, Finnair also wet leased planes to other airlines like British Airways and Eurowings. But by 2022, things were finally picking up again. Finnair announced flights to Dallas and Seattle in order to better connect to American Airlines and Alaska Airlines at their main hubs, as well as new flights to Mumbai in India and the resumption of flights to Fukuoka, Nagoya, and Sapporo in Japan. And finally, the beginning of flights to Busan, South Korea, and Tokyo Haneda, by which Finnair would offer flights to both airports in Tokyo. But that was before everything went to hell again. When Russia launched their full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the European Union and much of the West banned Russian airlines from their airspace, and as a result, Russia also banned European airlines from Russian airspace. And no airline outside of Russia and Ukraine was more affected than Finnair. This was bad, because you see, Finland is right next to Russia, and in order for Finnair to reach most of Asia, they have to fly over Russia. So any detour around Russia will be a lot more significant than for basically any airline, such that flights to Tokyo would now take around 13 hours to fly instead of the original 10 hours prior to the sanctions. In order to avoid that airspace, Finnair flights need to either go straight north towards the North Pole, fly over Alaska, and then make their way towards Japan or Korea. Or they need to fly straight south towards the Balkans, fly over Turkey, and turn west towards South or East Asia, depending on the destination. But Finnair is actually not at all new to any of this. In the 1980s, when Finnair launched their first flights to Tokyo, they had to fly around Soviet airspace. They had to fly over the North Pole towards Alaska and then make their way towards Japan. Finnair has only been able to fly over Russian airspace since 1994 on their way to Japan. When the invasion happened, Finnair canceled all their flights to Russia. They also canceled most of their flights to East Asia, including many of the flights that were supposed to begin later that year. Finnair later resumed many of these flights. Finnair nowadays flies to Tokyo Narita and Haneda, Osaka, Seoul Incheon, Shanghai Pudong, Hong Kong, Bangkok, Delhi, and Singapore, as well as seasonal flights to Phuket. Finnair also began flights to Mumbai. In 2022, Finnair also began flights to Dallas Fort Worth and Seattle. And then in winter 2022, Finnair terminated their long-haul flights from Stockholm and began flying to Doha, Qatar from Helsinki, Stockholm, and Copenhagen to better connect with their One World partner, Qatar Airways, which would provide loads of connections towards Asia, Africa, and Australia, just in time before the 2022 World Cup in Qatar. Despite all these challenges, Finnair's change in strategy has actually worked pretty well for them. Finnair's flights to North America seem to be doing very well, especially the flights to Dallas and Seattle. Flights to Asia seem to be doing okay despite the big detours, so Finnair plans to increase frequencies there and to resume winter seasonal flights to Dubai. Finnair's flights to Doha were also doing very well because of the Qatar Airways partnership. Flights to Mumbai were selling well, but they ended in July 2023 because they weren't selling enough business class seats to make the flight worth it. Finnair is also going to be wet leasing two Airbus A330s to Qantas for their flights to Singapore and Bangkok because Qantas doesn't have enough aircraft. Finnair seems to be doing a lot better than they expected to. However, their performance still hasn't reached 2019 levels just yet. I also don't know how Finnair will do in the future. The situation seems to be quite unstable for them because of the Russia situation and because of the hostilities in China, high fuel prices, and other shenanigans. But their strategy of focusing on new markets seems to be paying off. Finnair has been increasing flights within Europe as well as adding new destinations like Gdansk, Wrocław, and others. Finnair will likely keep working together with One World members to increase their load factors, to better utilize their aircraft, and to connect to more places around the world. However, this strategy will only last for as long as Russian airspace is closed. Once the situation improves in Asia, the aircraft currently used in Qatar will go back to flying to Asia. And who knows, maybe even the aircraft going to Dallas and Seattle will go to Asia instead. I guess it depends on the demand to each city. It also depends on how the situation in Russia turns out, and whether China is once again welcoming to foreign travelers or not. However, that will probably take quite some time because the Ukraine situation doesn't seem like it's going to be calming down anytime soon, and China doesn't seem to want to open back up like they were before the Rona. But no matter what happens, Finnair seems to have a backup, with the flights to Doha and the US and other Asian destinations that are easier to access and where demand is rising back up. Finnair still offers flights to Asia, of course, and even though distances and flight times are far longer than they were before, Finnair still schedules their Asia flights in such a way that they can make connections to Europe quite convenient, as well as connections between the Middle East and Eastern Europe towards North America and such. And of course, Finnair is trying to rely more on local business travel since it has lost a lot of their Asian market share. For now, Finnair is basically doing what it can, using their hub to their advantage, even if it has gone from being the best location for flights to Asia to the literal worst in a matter of hours. Thank y'all for watching. I hope y'all enjoyed this video. If y'all got any questions, comments, or any feedback, y'all can leave a comment. Anyway, that's all I got to say, and I'll see y'all later.